Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs Daily War Room Update. We are continuing on with our discussions of both the war in Gaza with the terrorists and on the other fronts, and also with the discussion on the wider subjects influencing and really that are part of this conflict that we have now with the terrorists. What we have seen in the last 24 hours Israeli continued fighting of the IDF forces in the Gaza Strip, quite intensive fighting going through into Khan Yunis, into Rafah, with many terrorists being killed there, and really tremendous terrorist infrastructures being uncovered and destroyed. We've seen terrorists who have filmed themselves firing RPGs at IDF forces, then being targeted by those same forces and being killed, luckily, and thank God with no injuries at that incident. But we are really talking about a lot of IDF injuries that we've suffered since the beginning of the war. Over 500 soldiers have already paid with their lives as part of this war, and that's a number that continues on. Unfortunately, as we've noted before, whilst the terrorists constantly claim that they're running out of fuel and food and water and everything else, they certainly aren't running out of rockets. And last night, as their way to mark the start of the new civil year, fired a barrage of rockets as the world was celebrating with fireworks. The Hamas terrorists were celebrating with rockets fired indiscriminately at Israel's mass civilian populations, at Tel Aviv and all of the surrounding areas, indiscriminately targeting millions of people just sleeping in their beds. On our northern front, as we discussed really in depth yesterday, we've continued on with that war of attrition with Hezbollah, with more attacks from Hezbollah and more responses by the IDF, taking out more of the terrorists there as well. The Houthis, the other Iranian proxy, are continuing on with their aggression as well, both interrupting the freedom of navigation and the open seas, and firing what it appears to be some type of projectile towards Israel that was shot down by the IDF in the evening and early morning as well. We've also seen on that front really a readiness of the international forces to strike back at the Houthis unless they cease and desist. And that's something that Lenny can maybe give us a quick update on just before we start our discussion with our guest. In Judea and Samaria, we've seen the continuation of the attempts to carry out more and more terrorist attacks. Yesterday, we had both a stabbing attack and a ramming attack. Those events carry on all the time, and at the same time, IDF forces arresting more and more terrorists. In Israel, we've seen, again, relative calm being maintained, and that's something which we are certainly thankful for. Before we go to our special guest, Lenny, maybe just give us an update on that idea of the international coalition that has now come together and is now really threatening the Houthis with a substantial force if they don't cease interrupting the freedom of navigation.
Thank you, Maurice. Things are moving to a head in the Gulf. The Houthis have shown tremendous chutzpah in attacking ships, not just the commercial ships, but also warships of the United States. And other countries are getting involved in shooting down missiles aimed at the armed forces. It includes a Japanese destroyer, a French destroyer or French ship, and now the British are moving in. They will be attacked and they will respond. Some of the American destroyers who have been playing a major role in the last 2 months in shooting down missiles, not only not missiles and drones sent at commercial vehicles, but also Israeli towns, have been involved in previous engagements with the Houthis and over the years, and have actually the same ships have shot down missiles and have fired missiles. And there are enough ships down there the Americans and from some of the allies that will be joining to fire a good number of Tomahawk missiles with precision at Houthi targets. So it bears watching.
Thank you, Lenny, for that update. And really, that brings us on to really straight on to our guest for today. Our guest for today is Rabbi Dr. Yakov Nagen. He's the founder and the director of the Ohr Torah Stone Interfaith Center. And what we'd like to welcome Dr. Rabbi Nagen for joining us. What we'd like to really discuss, Rabbi Nagen, is this idea of this conflict with, in the wider sense, with Iran, in the smaller sense with Hamas. It has all of the makings of a religious conflict. We know that the canard of this being a territorial battle is something which doesn't really hold water. And so everything is directing us in the direction of a religious war. Maybe you can tell us, since that, as opposed to territorial wars, which could possibly be solved with some type of a land deal, a religious war, and accepting that this is a religious war in nature is something which is possibly more frightening, because I don't think in history there's been an end to religious wars, and so this would be really a frightening prospect to consider. So maybe you can just introduce a little bit of the activities that you do as part of the interfaith program, the discussions that you're holding with partners, to maybe that we can nonetheless neutralize this religious ticking bomb.
Right. Certainly, although let me preface that neutralize is certainly too optimistic. Part of it, as in every struggle, it's how can we limit some of the forces that are being used against us. I think one of the great insights about the conflicts in the Middle East is, just as religion is part of the problem, it will therefore must be part of the solution. That religion is part of the problem, this is indisputable. The genocidal, anti-Semitic atrocities of the Hamas were done in the name of religion. They called their vicious attacks the Al-Aqsa flood, and quote often sources from their tradition. The second part of my opening statement is less obvious, that religion must also be part of the solution. We know, for example, John Lennon's very famous words in the song Imagine saw that a freedom from identity, national and religious, imagining no religions as a solution to humanity's problems. However, in the Middle East, where people's religious identities are very fundamental to who they are, you can't ignore those identities. And I may add that those ideologies that try to annul religious and national identities, such as communism, have not exactly been shining examples of universal rights and peace. And maybe another point before going on is pointing out the unholy alliance between radical Islam and the radical left, which seems surprising at first. The radical left denying religion, religious values, and national identity. But it's not surprising if we go back to the 20th century, remembering Hitler and Stalin, who also had a pact between them at one point, on the surface very different, but in totalitarian roots quite similar. But getting back to your question, indeed, religion has been a source of violence, certainly in the Hamas atrocities against Israel. But again, religious imagery have also been a positive force in recent years. Who would have believed when a few years ago, when the Abraham Accords began to be formed and spread through the Middle East? And in fact, recently, as opposed to Oslo and Camp David, the Abraham Accords are named after a figure which represents a potential of connection between the peoples of the Middle East. And during the current war, somebody, Rashid, who is the head of the Committee on Foreign Affairs and Defense Matters of the United Emirates, when asked about the future of the Abraham Accords, he said, the source of the Jewish people is not Paris and New York, but here in the Middle East. So too will be their future. I was at a little more than a year ago where I first met him, was hosted by the King of Morocco, a forum called the N7. N7, the 7 nations, Israel and the 6 Arab nations that have peace with it, in a conference in Rabat, Morocco, about how to promote the Abraham Accords. So we have competing vectors. Will religion as a force for violence, for evil and animosity, but also religion and religious imagery as playing a positive role. And to concede right away that religion is only a problem, we have conceded to a narrative that the enemy is trying to promote. The Hamas wants to convince the world, and certainly all of Islam, that there is a religious war between Judaism and Islam. One way to respond to that is to say, no, there is not a religious war between us, but the Hamas has a blasphemous perversion and gathering together leaders to speak out against and stand up against the Hamas. And this is the center of my activities before the war and during the war. And I'll be happy in many ways to expand on this. But perhaps maybe before asking for follow-up guidance from you, to say a few words about why is it that religion could be such a deadly source of evil. One comment made to me by a friend of mine, Imam Talib Sharif, who is the Imam of America's oldest mosque, the Muhammad Mosque in Washington, who in fact visited us with a group of imams shortly before the war and came out with very strong statements after the massacre on October 7th. When asked, why is it there's so much violence in the name of religion, he said, religion is power. Power corrupts. But just like power can destroy the world, power can also build the world. And the reason why religion is power, since religion for its adherents represents ultimate truth, value, meaning. This is very powerful and certainly could surely be misused. Secondly, religion is identity. Our identities could set us against each other, but identities could also connect us to one another. And this is the narrative that we try to promote. If the Abraham Accords were creating a narrative of a shared ethnic and religious tradition to bring us together in a great story that we are all part of, there's a religious and ethnic identity we know are being used often to set us against each other. So the question is how to tell the story differently, our heads and our hearts, that the big story is our identities connect us and stand together against the blasphemous heresy and perversion of the Hamas and other forces.
So what we're really discussing, Rabbi Nagen, is really two different ideas. I think it's and here possibly I would question just one thing that was mentioned, is that we're talking about Islam as a religion of peace, of violence. That's a question mark. When we see violence in the name of religion, what we've really seen in the last probably 20, 30 years, 40 years, the only religion really that's carrying out these mass massacres in the name of religion, for want of a better term, Israeli Islam, this fight between Shia and Sunni, tens of thousands of people being murdered on that basis, on the one hand, and then framing this whole discussion in terms of Israel and its neighbors, whether it be Hamas, who specifically use the term Dar al-Islam for saying that, well, all of these areas are Islamic lands, and no one else can ever be allowed to have any type of sovereignty over them. So maybe can we break down possibly
Certainly.
those two ideas and see where that's going? Is religion the source of violence, or just one particular religion, at least in the most recent past? And how do we get over that definition of Islam and Islamic lands?
Right. Certainly. And first, again, part of the challenges of looking at reality is not black and white. It's not, is Islam this or that? And I could comment that actually a Christian friend of mine once pointed out, that about 1300 years after the foundation of Christianity, there were incredibly violent religious wars in the name of Christianity, whether the Protestants, Catholics, which a large part of the Middle Ages. And he pointed out that we're about the same time zone after the foundation of Islam, which wasn't necessarily reassuring, because those Christian religious wars, whether civil wars among themselves or against others, went on for a long, long time. But relating to processes that are taking place now, and in a very diverse populations. I was recently both in Jakarta, Indonesia, and in a follow-up conference in Princeton University by a process initiated by the world's largest Islamic group, the Nahdlatul Ulama. It's an Indonesian group, which means the awakening of the scholars. And they are building on a global level, networking throughout the world, reinterpretations of classical ideologies. For example, they came out about seeing the ideal as the nation state and not the Khalifut, minority rights in Islam. And they work closely in contact with major forces on a global level. So I was there in Jakarta, Indonesia, with leaders of world religions in general, for an initiative whose fruition took place in Princeton 2 weeks ago. It is now 75 years to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That document has often been misused, and the feeling of both the misuse of that document and the lack of fulfillment, also the lack of input of religion, largely because, again, acknowledging that religion has been a source for evil and violence, or very large, as you mentioned, in recent decades, primarily Islam, and thinking what is the process to overcome by taking responsibility for these problems, and then give a religiously based Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This was worked on. The final wording will be delivered next week, but this is a networking of global religious leaders, and all talking about their pain. We had the leader of Christianity in Nigeria, the primate, talking about the world's ignoring the terror of the Boko Haram, which years ago it was a couple of headlines, but long being forgotten. So very candid discussions and acknowledgement of the problems. So yes, the evil in the world, it's there. The violence is there. In no way do I try to minimize it or ignore it, but realizing there are other forces, and we must network with them. Already in March, this is half a year before October 7th, in the era of the city of Najaf, Iraq, a 40-page religious ruling was written about the Hamas being equivalent to to ISIS, point by point, showing the similarities between Hamas and ISIS. And in that, pointing out their desire for genocide against the Jewish people, their deliberate targeting women and children. So yes, there's the Hamas is ISIS, but there are other forces, and we must wisely work together to overcome this ISIS in all its variants. And one last quote from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs would often make the point how we should stop using the word fundamentalists to describe violent religious extremists, because these are the people who generally violate the fundamentals of their respective religions. So let us not concede to the so-called fundamentalists that they are the authentic, correct interpretation of their religion, and rather combat them in their home front to show how they are perversive, blasphemous interpretations. And this, I could give numerous examples, including the quotes that the Hamas used in their attack. I could respond within their sources about this, as I've done extensively throughout the world, throughout the Islamic world.
And that's quite incredible. We actually had a guest on our program just a few weeks ago from England, Noor Dahari. You may be familiar with his work.
Yes, certainly.
Both an expert on Islamic fundamentalism, terrorism, as he described himself, as an ex-terrorist himself, and as preparation, he actually sent me that fatwa from the committee, from the jurisprudential resolution of Islamic fatwa.
Yes,
really, which was quite comprehensive in the subjects that it discussed, whether it be the rights of women, the abuse of women, the abuse of children, in the name of Islam. And reading that document, it seemed to be that there is a massive, really, abyss between what appears to be a very progressive document and what we're seeing with Hamas. And really, Hamas isn't alone in this interpretation. Obviously, you're seeing that hidden hand from behind Iran, the mullahs, the ayatollahs, pushing this idea of fundamentalist Islam, of creating the caliphate, and really undermining everything that fatwa was talking about. And I thought, well, this is nice, but who actually signs onto that? How extensive is it? Is it extensively? Is it accepted? Is it understood? Is it welcomed? Or is that more of a fringe definition and explanation of an expression even of Islam, rather than the mainstream, which would seem to be particularly violent and really foreign to most Western values?
Okay, so I'll try to give the map as I see it, and I think part of the challenge is to realize, even facing in the Middle East, the diabolical connection between the two forces that are opposing us. Understanding that pathology is critical to answer your question, meaning there are two dialogues. There's the Islamic ISIS radicalism, that's one force. But another force is the neo-Marxist decolonialism, which we know is no less perverse, again, an inverse of reality. And I feel it is that terminology and mindset which has empowered the radical Islam, and even within the Middle East. Let me give an example from when I was in Indonesia, in Jakarta, a month ago. In Indonesia, there's a lot of anti-Israel sentiment. Now, why is that the case? It's not because they are jihadists. It's because they were under the European colonialism. Their great story is their freedom from European colonialism. And copy paste, the man on the street that doesn't know that much, seeing that we were under the Europeans, and to sell them a narrative that so too our Muslim brethren in the Middle East are under another colonial group. It's an easy sell. But when I've been in Indonesia, I've been interviewed about this and surprised how the messages were that in response were so accurately portrayed. I was when asked in Jakarta last month about Israeli colonialism, I went back to the beginning about the Ottoman Empire when it broke up into nation states, the Jewish people, an indigenous part of the Middle East for thousands of years, the tiny slice we got, and we're in our ancient homeland. And in fact, as opposed to so many other Middle Eastern countries, we actually have a name and language that reflects our origins. And then I went to their sources. I said, and look, within the Quran, I quoted, in the Quran, Surat al-Isra, the 17th surah of the Quran, verse 104, the promise of the hereafter foretold the return of the Jewish people to the Holy Land, just as they entered after Egypt. The Quran tells this. I said, these are your sources. Free yourselves from this secular European language of decolonialization. I spoke not only about Israel proper. I live in Har Hebron. I spoke about Hebron, about how until the massacre in 1929, the continuous Jewish presence in Hebron. To my surprise, everything I said appeared in the interview in one of their Islamic papers. I used Google Translate to get it back to check them. And people get it. So I feel it's the reason why in the streets are so much the knee-jerk identity with your ethnic group, the neo-Marxist decolonialism has sold far too well in the third world. But to pin it only on extreme Islam means we won't confront it properly. To see there are two issues involved here. And on the religious side, I feel that a response of deep discussion about the tradition, the sources, go over well. And again, even the Middle East, it's so not monolithic. Morocco, for example, the king of Morocco is King Mohammed VI, is really a warm and wonderful figure. He has, in the isolated instances of anti-Jewish violence, when it happens, he goes on national television to speak against it. His primary advisor, Andre Azoulay, who I have the privilege of meeting several times, is a proud Jew. And I remember him at the point of tears in Rabat, Morocco, telling us how he had in the official constitution of Morocco, defining what is Morocco, in the first paragraph, referring to its Hebraic roots. So again, I feel the ISIS perversion is, it's there, it's deadly, but the unholy alliance with neo-Marxism, decolonialism, and fake news has made it as deadly as it is. So we must break into components. What are we facing? And I deal with the religious opponent, and I feel it's not that people think I'm an optimist. No, if indeed the Hamas would succeed in truly convincing all of Islam about a holy war, we would be in a much worse situation.
So that from as many of our viewers have really pointed out, Rabbi Nagen, is this understanding of what exactly, and Bob Meyer really has been discussing this a lot, this idea of how do we get over this almost insurpassable obstacle, and this definition of Dar el-Islam. Once any area was conquered by Islam, it then becomes Islamic forever. and that seems to be what not only the fundamentalist Muslims are using as an excuse to murder people, but really that seems to be the source of some of, or at least most of the conflict, also with Hamas and the other terrorist organizations and the Palestinians in general, because the Palestinian Authority isn't necessarily different in its they may be different in its religious adherence, but not in its fundamental religious basing. And so they use those two ideas of one idea of Dar al-Islam to justify attacking Israel, and then similarly using the Hadith, which says that whilst you may quote Surah Al-Isra that says that, well, this in the time of redemption, this will be obviously a Jewish homeland. They say that, well, in the time of redemption, it can only come along when the stones and the trees will call out to the believers and call them and say, well, there are Jews hiding behind us, come and kill them. How do we put those two together? How do we really reconcile between those ideas?
So this goes beyond the scope of one podcast. It's to understand the exact pathology of interpretation, misinterpretation. So many, whether it's what is from the Quran, what's the hadith is, there are hundreds of thousands of hadiths, and it's known that so many of them are forgeries. So many of them say exactly the opposite of one another. The Hamas indeed quotes that hadith, but it doesn't quote the endless amount of hadiths that say exactly the opposite. So this is part of the tragedy that ego power search has led to choosing certain sources and ignoring and annulling and abrogating so many other sources. Again, it's a long process, but as they say in Hebrew, the eternal people don't fear a long journey. One model, which I think is important to keep in mind, between Jewish-Christian relations have been transformed dramatically since the Holocaust. In the process called Nostra Aetate, Latin for in our times, began a rethinking and reinterpretation of Christian theology relating to the Jewish people. And sometimes I think too many Jews have short memories because they don't remember how bad it used to be. The collective responsibility for Christ killers, the Jewish suffering throughout history as a proof for God by the curse of the wandering Jew, etc., etc. The strides that Jewish Christians relations have taken, which in itself could be a series of podcasts, and insights about how and why that process took place, gives us insight for parallel processes relating to the Islamic world, where the pathology or the anti-Jewish pathology is, in my opinion, is much less rooted than it was in the previous story. And again, but part of the question is knowing who are the friends, who are your foes. I know Israel spent a lot of effort grooming Erdogan in Turkey, but from the inside, Erdogan it's built in that he's going to be a supporter of the Hamas. On the other hand, Erdogan's great enemy, who I developed a personal relationship with, Fethullah Gulen, who has 8 million followers. He lives in exile in Pennsylvania, a great charismatic leader. Part of it, he's Erdogan's enemy because he has a more spiritual and open form of Islam. So part of it is we have to understand the map to distinguish between friend and foe. And this is part of the challenge because we're not big enough to do everything alone. We have to identify who can be allies for the sake of all of us.
So maybe
Rabbi, can I interrupt for a second?
Please.
Rabbi, as you were talking about the cooperation and the interpretations between religious and Muslims and Jews, I kept thinking one word, inshallah, halavai. I have had a lot of experience with dealing politically with Muslim countries, whether it's Indonesia, Qatar, Jordan, Turkey, Pakistan, Algeria. Where we never tread was on the religious issues. I'm very thankful that there's a church and a mosque and a shul that's gone up in the Emirates, but it's not really a religious issue, because once you tread into the religious issues, and you're going to fall into minefields. And I'm not as optimistic that we can get out of it. Gulen, for instance, the Turkish exile, is an enemy of the state, according to Erdogan. And I've met with Erdogan. It is not a good thing that what we have going on, because it's not just a religious issue. It goes back to something more fundamental. Erdogan, the Muslim, and Hamas get their resources, and also their religious resources, from the Muslim Brotherhood, which is based in Qatar. And there are pictures of the Qatari Sheikha, the Queen Mother, with some of the biggest Muslim Brotherhood leaders. It goes beyond just Hamas. And
certainly, it's Qatar, it's Turkey, it's quite a long list.
And so I don't see us getting out of this in the near future. I once had a discussion with someone who we both admire and respect, Rabbi Riskin, and it was a discussion on how Maimonides looked at Islam. And he was fairly tolerant and thought that Islam was not idol worship. And today, Rabbi Riskin and I discussed, because of the death cult we're seeing by many in Islam, it is an idol worshiper now. And he told me that he would not go into a mosque today, which is something that he probably would have wanted in the past because of the idol worship aspect. The Islam, or a large part of it, is sacrificing to Moloch their children. And so it is really a problem. And until we see a reformation, which could be as violent, it maybe has been as violent as what the Christians went through in Europe, I don't see us getting out of the problem of this radical fundamentalist, to use a term that Rabbi Sachs doesn't like. I don't see us getting out of this minefield.
Yeah. So maybe I'll end with something that came out more positive than expectations. At first, the Hamas tried desperately to get the Israeli Arabs to join the violence that would really wreak mayhem, with all the soldiers out on the front. Desperately, they tried to get a fifth column, and many have seen and acknowledged and appreciated that not only was it less than fears were been, it hasn't really materialized at all. In fact, there have been numerous statements. For example, one interesting point I'd like to make: Israel has 4 Arab political parties. Balad didn't get in. The one which most is supportive of coexistence with Israel, we're talking about the 4 Israeli Arab parties, is actually the Islamic. Is the one religious of the 4 parties. There's the Communist Party, the Nationalist Party, Balad, Hadash Tal, and as he's been always, Mansour Abbas has been outspoken about, since October 7th, but also in previous terror attacks, and I feel there too. I know that many of the people around him, I know them personally, but lack of distinction. There is the northern part of the Islamic movement who are terrorist supporters. There's the southern, to understand from the inside who's who. Not making these distinctions are to our great loss. And later tonight, I'll be interviewed on Israeli Arabic television and also on these topics. So as I say, I'm not coming with a message of optimism. My concern is that things, if we do not distinguish, also even among enemies, what is the different level? People that don't like us and people that are there ready to kill us. If we don't distinguish, if as far as we're concerned, they're all the same, we're not going to respond to the challenges in a correct way.
I didn't make my point clear, therefore. If it stays in politics, power, economy, these issues, then it's doable. And there can be even a Abraham Accord. If it gets into the roots of religion, then we start running into problems. And we should try to divorce our relationships with some countries from the religious aspects.
The only problem is they are very
religious.
The religious ethnic identities are very deep rooted, and so to ignore you ignore them at our own peril. So it's but again, I'm trying to think, what's the downside? What's the downside to political concessions? There's a downside, such as unilaterally leaving Gaza, creating Palestinian states. There's a downside that wishful thinking could bring deadly consequences. But creating more personal relations with those who are willing to call for a different approach to the Jewish people in Israel, cultivating those relations. It's hard to see what the downside is. I try to reach out to moderate and empower and to moderate Muslim voices to see how they are appreciated, to see that they're not taken for granted, to see that we acknowledge that sometimes they put themselves at risk, to empower them, to strengthen them, to if people could feel that the results will be limited, but as opposed to political decisions and economic decisions, the downside is, I think, is not there.
To be continued.
To be continued.
That really is something which we have to continue to discuss, because I think that there is tremendous strength. I'm sure you'll both agree in the idea of the Abraham Accords, in the idea of this. We are all one or interconnected nations, all coming down from Abraham, and we should be able to find the way, like within every family, find the way to identify our common denominators and to strengthen them, and to try and limit and even marginalize the ideas that would separate us apart, that would put us into conflict. And I think that's obviously one of the better and the more powerful messages of the Abraham Accords, that we can find this way, despite the ideas and the differences of religion, into finding a way to live together. Because this idea of religion against religion, like I said before, is something which doesn't provide much hope for the future. That we will forever live on our swords, and they will forever live on their swords, trying to kill us. That's something which doesn't provide very much hope going forward, and it shouldn't necessarily be the question, which is what really I think, Lenny, your point is also part of that idea of the Abraham Accords, is identifying, moving on from the stage of religion against religion or religion to religion, and identifying the common interests of the different peoples in the area, and using them as a way forward. And I think that would be really a tremendous way to go forward if we really could. And I think that fatwas like we saw and we discussed previously, your discussions, Jakarta, and really extending out a moderate, I don't know if we can call it moderate Islam or mainstream Islam or non-fundamentalist Islam, has to be, I think, the key to moving forward.
Yeah. Thank you for the encouragement.
Keep it up, inshallah.
I will be forever the optimist that that we can find a way to get to that happy median. As Lenny knows, and maybe we can tell you, Rabbi Nagen, and our audience, the Jerusalem Center does have extensive connections with our regional partners. We have discussions on a whole host of different subjects. We're really in discussions with very many people, and I think that the guiding principle there as well is our common interests rather than our dividing factors, and that's something which I hope we can develop. Rabbi Nagen, would you like to, as we slowly, or actually quite quickly, run out of time, give us one final takeaway, a message of hope?
Wow. Okay, so maybe I'll give you one recent event. I mean, recently, Rahat is Israel's largest Muslim city, with more than 80,000 residents. They were very hardly hit, both by being murdered during October 7th. Some of the hostages are from there, but one of the heroes of October 7th, somebody I know personally, Yusuf Ali Abbas, he's a minibus driver. On Friday, he took a minibus to the party at Re'im, the Nova party, and he said, "I'll pick you up on Saturday." When the shooting began, he went faster as a minibus and started driving back. People tried to stop him. "You're crazy, they're shooting." He went under heavy fire, squeezed more than 30 people into his minibus, and since he's a Bedouin, he knew side roads and left a whole procession of cars, saving all of them. 4 of his cousins were among the captives, 2 of which who were released. And I spent one day with the rabbis and all the imamim of the Bedouin Pazura in the city of Rahat, in their municipality center with Israeli flags, filling food packages for refugees, both Jewish and Arab, from the southern. We studied sources together, discussions together, and then we prayed together. So again, the Hamas is as bad, is as evil as we know, but there are other forces in the world, and we must learn to work together because we're too small to do everything alone.
Well said.
That is amazing, and really that is a note really of hope. We don't we haven't discussed it enough on the program. The acts of tremendous heroism carried out by Israeli Arabs, by Muslims, saving Jews on the day of the massacre. Really, if we can, I don't know, maybe we can. You will be able to help us, Rabbi Nagen, to connect us to someone who we haven't yet been able to find someone who speaks English who could come on the program and really articulate that idea of that joint and common background and really future and destiny. That would be a tremendous thing if we could maybe make that happen. On that note, thank you, Lenny. Thank you, Rabbi Nagen, for joining us. We will be back with you again tomorrow at 4 o'clock. Tomorrow's program and in general, Tuesdays from now on, to a great extent, will be devoted to the subject of anti-Semitism in Europe, dealing with anti-Semitism, the different aspects of anti-Semitism. It will be run by one of the Jerusalem Center Fellows, Fiamma Nierenstein, an author of dozens of books and a member of the Italian Parliament, a journalist, really one of those people who have done so much that it puts us lazy people to shame. And so she will be with you tomorrow at 4 o'clock. Again, thank you, everyone. In the meantime, stay safe. For those that weren't with us yesterday, we wish you also a happy civilian New Year, and may it bring really a year of peace to all of us and to the region.